So today we're going to talk about how to use documents to answer a question, and in this case, a DBQ, which is a document-based question. We're going to use a sampling of documents, not the one that we're actually going to do as a class and individuals, but a separate one called Why Did So Many Colonists Die at Jamestown? Jamestown is obviously something we've already studied, so we chose these documents to model for you. So if the question you're thinking about is, why did so many colonists die at Jamestown? Each document you look at somehow is going to help you answer that question in an essay later on. As you're looking at each of the documents, the first thing you need to do is look at what kind of document it is. In this case, if you're looking at the document, document A looks like an excerpt from some sort of book or a journal. Then the next question you ask is it a primary or secondary source? And the way to figure that out is to look at the date in which it was published. In this case, the year 2000. And we know that the Jamestown colony was founded in 1607 and, survived through the 17th century and became what is now Williamsburg, Virginia. So we know that, actually it's part of Williamsburg, Virginia, but we know that this document was written in 2000. So the first question you can answer is, this is an excerpt from a book or journal. The second question is, it is a secondary source because it was written in the year 2000. If it would have said 1607, 1608, 1609, then it would be a primary source. So we know this is a secondary source. Then when you look at a secondary source, you should say who wrote it and why are they a credible source. In this case, Dennis B. Blanton is from the Center for Archaeological Research at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. So we can assume that Dennis B. Blanton is a researcher at this research center in Virginia by Jamestown. So his credibility increases right there. Then we can look at the title of the document, Jamestown's Environment. And remember, the question that you're answering is, why did so many colonists die at Jamestown? So we know that this excerpt is on the environment at Jamestown. And then you would read through the excerpt. In this case, many people have commented over the last 4 centuries on the qualities of Jamestown's environment. Because the adjacent river and creeks became brackish as water levels rose, reliable sources of fresh water would have been scarce by the 17th century. English colonists dug shallow wells to supply themselves with sources of drinking water, but these were vulnerable to drought and saltwater intrusion. Also, historian Carville V. Earle attributed disease in the early years to Jamestown's position at the salt-fresh water transition, where filth introduced into the river tended to fester rather than flush away. The island is not situated at a point of great natural food abundance, especially relative to other locations very close by. Fish are present in local streams, but only in the spring and early summer are they there in impressive abundance. So after I've read through the whole document, I'm going to go back. The first sentence tells me that over the last 4 centuries, people have commented on Jamestown's environment. That means that people have been studying Jamestown's environment and maybe trying to answer the question of why so many colonists died there for a long, long time. This is just another study on Jamestown's environment that is reviewing, in this case, other research on Jamestown. In this case, it also suggests that there are sometimes the creek and water around Jamestown became brackish. I might look up the word brackish. I don't know what that word is. If I did look it up, it would mean water that is kind of sedentary, not moving, getting full of algae. It's not fresh. And we know that in order to survive, colonists would need fresh water. They did dig wells to supply themselves with water, but they were vulnerable to drought and saltwater intrusion. That means that there must have been drought around the time of Jamestown settling, maybe. Maybe we can find that in another document. Saltwater intrusion would mean water coming from the rivers and creeks would get into their wells and they wouldn't be able to drink it. Then we have historian Carville V. Earle saying that there was disease in the early years because of Jamestown's position at a salt-fresh water transition where the river tended to fester than flush away. That would mean there would be waste, colonists' wastes in the water that they were drinking. Might that help me answer the question of why so many colonists died? The last point says fish are only present in local streams in the spring and early summer, which means in the fall and winter, there aren't a lot of fish in the streams. And if I don't stockpile and I don't think about planning ahead, that might cause colonists to die. So that's document A. And then the next thing you do is you look at other documents, and in this case, document B, and you say, okay, first thing, what kind of source is this? This is different than document A. Document A was an excerpt from a study or a review of studies. Document B looks like some sort of chart or graph. I see that it has rainfall index on one side and the year on the lower side. It also suggests that there might have been a drought at Jamestown. So just by looking at the graph, I'm thinking, oh, document A talked about drought. Maybe this is a graph that actually shows when the droughts were. Then I would say, it looks like 1560, 1600, 1640. Maybe this is a primary source. Oh, but wait, I look up where it says source, 1998. So this is another secondary source that is addressing Jamestown. In this case, it's an adaptation from a Science magazine article called The Lost Colony and Jamestown Droughts, April 24th, 1998. So we know this is an article in Science magazine about Jamestown. That's interesting, a Science magazine publishing a study on the lost colony at Jamestown. And it is centered on this drought index. And let's see what it says here. This study determined rainfall amounts by examining tree ring patterns in old cypress trees, that sounds cool, growing near Jamestown. Every year leaves a growth ring inside the trunk of a tree. A wider ring indicates plenty of rainfall and good growth. That would be these white marks along the graph. A narrow ring usually means less rain. 0 on the chart means average tree ring size and therefore average rainfall. So anything above 0 is good rainfall, good growth. 0 is average, and anything below 0 is negative, meaning there wasn't a lot of rain. So then I look at this and I say, oh, 1607 to 1610, the first 3 years of Jamestown, one of the worst droughts in Jamestown history. So remember, I'm using these documents to answer the question, why did so many colonists die? So in this case, we have a graph that is telling us that in the 3 years when the colony was founded, it was one of the worst droughts in Jamestown's history. So then I would look at the next document, document C, and first question is, what kind of document is this? And in this case, it is a ships list, first and second Jamestown ships list. This might not be a secondary source because it's an actual ship list from Jamestown. Let's just double check. This says, adapted from John Smith, The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles, Book 3, 1624. 1624. That sounds like a primary source to me. Not to mention the fact that I know John Smith is one of the men who saved Jamestown after doing my background study of the Jamestown colony. So this is an actual ship list from a man at Jamestown that he adapted and printed in 1624. But it is a primary source because if you look, the ship list records 1607 and 1608. And we know that John Smith is one of the original founders and one of the saviors of the Jamestown colony. So we can say to ourselves, this document is a ship list, a primary source written by John Smith and adapted in a later history of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles that he printed in 1624. So then after I know that it's a primary source written by John Smith, someone who actually saved the Jamestown colony, I might say, oh, he's pretty knowledgeable. And here he has made a list of the first original settlers in May 1607, and then the second resupply of settlers in January 1608. He's also listed on this actual document the occupation of the people that came over in the first original settlers group and the second resupply. I would then look at the document and say, what are some of the occupations? And in this case, we have governors, gentlemen, laborers, barrel makers, carpenters, blacksmiths, sail makers, barbers, bricklayers, masons, tobacco pipe makers, tailors, drummers, preachers, boys, jeweler, refiners and goldsmiths, gunsmith, a wig maker, a druggist, a surgeon, and some that are occupation unknown. We also have a total of male and female colonists. And then we have a note on the bottom that says, a gentleman was a person of wealth who was not used to working with his hands. Interesting. I would also make note of the fact that in the first group of settlers and the second group of settlers, there were 0 female settlers, no females included. Why did so many colonists die at Jamestown is this question I'm trying to answer for my essay later on. So a gentleman was a person of wealth who was not used to working with his hands. There were 110 male settlers in the first original group and 120 in the resupply group. Then I would look at the actual jobs that these people came over with, the experience that they came over with. The number that I look at in the first original settlers that sticks out to me is 47 gentlemen. And I just realized on the bottom is a person of wealth who was not used to working with his hands. How would that help a colony out in the middle of the wilderness? I don't know. Then I would look down at the next biggest group is 28. 28 have no occupation, no known occupation. This is not looking good for the Jamestown settlers in the first year when they arrive. What are some of the other numbers? We have 12 laborers, 6 governors, sounds like a gentleman to me, 4 carpenters, 4 boys, which are probably young kids, and then we have one each of one blacksmith, 1 sailmaker, 1 barber, 1 bricklayer, 1 mason, 1 tailor, 1 drummer, 1 preacher, and 1 surgeon for all 110 settlers at Jamestown in 1607. What I might say to myself is, just from looking at this number, we have way more gentlemen, governors, and boys than we do of people who can actually try to make this colony succeed. People who can actually lay bricks, people who can actually build houses, buildings, barns, etc. And then I would say to myself, did that change in the year 1608? Remembering that the question is, why did so many colonists die at Jamestown? So if I look at the list in 1608, the number that's the highest is occupation unknown. The next highest is gentlemen. They did increase the number of laborers, which are I skipped that before, which are basically people who are told what to do and labor for those people. They also increased the number of tailors, which are people who make clothes. They added some refiners and goldsmiths. Interesting. Why would they need a goldsmith? Maybe they thought there was some gold in Jamestown. They added 2 druggists who weren't there in the trip before, a wig maker, a gunsmith, a jeweler, a tobacco pipe maker, and they sent 1 extra barrel maker. If I say to myself, they only sent 1 extra surgeon. Of all these jobs in terms of survival of my colony, I would say a wig maker, a tailor, I don't know, a pipe maker, would those people actually help me save a colony from dying off? I don't know. More people with occupation unknown, that sounds questionable. More general laborers that don't have a craft. I don't know about that. Lots and lots of more gentlemen. So again, looking at this document, I would say in the first 2 shipments of settlers to Jamestown, how would this help me answer the question of why colonists died? Well, it doesn't look like they sent very many people who actually knew how to build a colony. They sent a lot of gentlemen who didn't know what they were doing, who never worked with their hands in their life, and people who didn't have crafts. And in the second ship, they sent a bunch of people, jewelers, goldsmiths, tobacco pipe makers. I don't know if that would help Jamestown survive in the first few years of its settlement. And I'd also note that it says May 1607 and January 1608. So knowing what I know from the other documents, what happened in that first winter? Might something have happened in that first winter? Did these gentlemen in the first settlement remember to put away some fish and save some food by the time the first resupply came? So I'm going to look at the next document now and see if that might answer my question. It may or may not. Sometimes they relate, sometimes they don't. The final document, the first document was an excerpt from a book or a journal. The second was the graph of Jamestown droughts. The third was an actual primary source from John Smith. That was a ship's list. And this last one, I'm going to look right now. It says, 1609. Maybe that's a primary source. But nope. If you look at the top, 1994. Ivor Noel Hume, The Virginia Adventure, Alfred Knopf. So I'm going to say to myself, this is a secondary source. It's an excerpt from a book written by Ivor Noel Hume called The Virginia Adventure. I know that because it's italicized. It's not in quotation marks. And I know that it was written in 1994. So who is Ivor Noel Hume? I don't know. I'm not told who he is. I could, if I had access to the internet, look up his background and see what he is. But I'm assuming, since I was given this document by my teacher, that it's a credible source. Then I would look at the actual excerpt. What's it about? It says in 1609. So it sounds like Ivor Noel Hume might be a historian writing about Jamestown, something around the time of 1609. And it said, in 1609, Francis West and 36 men sailed up the Chesapeake Bay to try to trade for corn with the Powhawkmi Indians. Although still a part of Powhatan's confederacy, the tribe had seen less of the English than had those closer at hand, and with luck might be more friendly. And so it proved. Though Francis West, was able to load his small ship with grain, the success involved some harsh and cruel dealinage by cutting of 2 of the savages' heads and other extremities. The ship and her life-saving cargo returned to Jamestown. No one doubted that this new supply of grain would help, but it would not be enough to last the winter. On the other hand, decided the ship's crew, it was plenty to get them fatly home to England. So it was that Francis West, by the persuasion, or rather by the enforcement of his company, hoisted up the sails and headed out into the Atlantic, leaving the colonists to the Indians and to God. All right, Francis West. Interesting character. First of all, he sails up the Chesapeake to try to trade corn with some Indians. We haven't heard of any Indians in the documents, but we know from studying Jamestown that Powhatan was the most powerful Native American chief in the area where the Jamestown settlers settled. He had a confederacy of Native American tribes, and their interaction with the English in this case looks like it was a good one. It looks like he gave grain to West and his people. It does discuss the cutting of 2 of the savages' heads and other extremities. So there probably is some assumption in this document that the relationship between the Jamestown settlers and the Native Americans was not always good. So reminding myself that why did so many colonists at Jamestown die, I might say maybe they had issues with Native Americans. The ship and her cargo returned to Jamestown, and at that point, you have West and his crew deciding that they're going to sail back to England with the grain that they had gotten from Powhatan, leaving the Indians and the colonists to God, heading out in the Atlantic. So you have a group of settlers that literally hoist up their sails and leave the colony with the grain they were given by the Native American chief. So this one is interesting. It brings up the Native American issue, and it brings up the fact that the colonists are divided. There are some that want to stay and tough it out in the winter, and there's others that want to leave. So again, how would I use these 4 documents to answer the question, why did so many Jamestown colonists die, is what we're going to be working on next.